let's bring in Glenn Hefferan. We've been talking about having him on all week. We talked about having him on last year. He's the commissioner and president of the United States Hockey League, which is the #1 league in the United States. It's a massive feeder for the NHL, the NCAA, you name it. So it's good to have you this morning, Glenn. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, guys.
So look, I wanted to start this off, and then, Johnny will eventually chime in here and probably ask you.
Well, I was cut 2 years in a row by the USHL, so I don't even know if I can talk.
Some sort of goofy question here, Glenn, but let's just start with this. Okay, give us a little state of the union on the United States Hockey League, because I do feel like we have a lot of our show's listeners and followers that are Canadian. They know a lot about the CHL. They don't know a lot about the USHL because, with the USHL, what's different than in Canada is our USHL, and you correct me if I'm wrong, it is the main feeder to the NCAA, which is then our main feeder to the NHL, right? Where in Canada, you don't have that step in between, right? So I don't think the USHL is as well known in Canada. So give us a state of the union on the health of the league, because for people who know about it, it's booming.
I will tell you, one of the I was with a Division I coach a few months back during our draft, and he said, the USHL is more than a development league; it's a survival league. The players that we get just know how to survive. They're battle tested because the league is so tough to play in. So the state of the union of the league has never been better. Just to go through some of the numbers, what is there, about 800 NHL players on rosters? 195 of them are USHL alum. There's about 1,800 Division I college hockey players. 910 of them are tied to the USHL. So, and it's not just there. The American League, the USHL over the last 12 seasons has put over 3,000 players into the American Hockey League. Now, if you looked at last year's NHL rosters, 78% of those players will play in the American Hockey League before they play in the National Hockey League. So we're developing them to every single level. And the nice part, I think the strong part about our league is that players leave at their development pace. If they're not tied to a contract, they don't have to play a certain number of years. If they get drafted and it's a college route for them after, it's an American League route or the NHL, they simply go. And I think that's the transformational nature of the USHL. And we're not just developing players; we're developing coaches, general managers, trainers, equipment managers. So all across the spectrum, we're moving people onto every level of the game, and I think that's probably about the best compliment we can make.
And you're also getting strong crowds. Like, I made a joke before that I was cut 2 years in a row, but the team that cut me was the Sioux Falls Stampede, and that rink, the Denny, has become a hotbed for the NCAA tournament as well. They get great crowds over there in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. It's actually where our sponsor Out West is based out of, so shout out to them too. But can you talk about just the following and the fan bases of the USHL as well? Because you bring in big names like Fantilli, Celebrini, all these fans want to watch these young kids before
all
they
the
go
U.S. national team players. They all play in the USHL, and I don't think a lot of people realize that.
Yeah, I mean, there's the USHL is made up of 16 teams. Sioux Falls is certainly a special place. Their wiener dog race game, with 11,025 fans last year. I think the league's overall attendance was about 1.5 million last year. Wow. And what was really interesting is our following on Flow Sports was up 37%. And I think that has a lot to do with some of the changes we made in how we approach social media and things like that. So from that standpoint, people are getting to see our games. We've done a lot of live to streaming games for free so that people didn't have to pay. That was compliments of Flow Sports. So I think from those standpoints, we're really doing well on that front. In terms of Canadians not knowing our league, I'll push back a little bit on that, in that about 80% of the USHL is American players. The next tranche of that is Canadian players. And so when you look at let's say the CHL, 92% of their league is Canadian. Mm-hmm. I think it's fair to say that the Canadian players know that this is a pathway to develop. And we've been, because we have to develop for college and pro, we have to keep that student athlete perspective in mind. So there's no other league that is more uniquely positioned than the USHL, to develop players. There's a reason why half of college hockey is from the USHL, from only 16 teams. We're really good at what we do. Our GMs, our coaches, all of our team support, they understand the mission for these players, and it is a players first mentality.
Well, you brought up some numbers there, and you're talking about the NHL. I saw a stat and about basically like players that are drafted into the National Hockey League based on the fact that like you only have 16 teams and the CHL has 60 something teams. Can you give us those numbers to put in perspective, like, players per league that are getting drafted and where the USHL fits into that category?
Sure. I want to be careful here because I have my own personal motto is Teddy Roosevelt: speak softly and carry a custom Bauer hockey stick. How to plug our sponsor.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that when you break down the numbers, we do it on the aggregate of the entire league, all 16 teams. I know there's some out there as well, you can't count NTDP. Well, yeah, we can, because they play in our league. That's a team in our league. It would be saying, well, we're not going to count London in OHLs. Like, it's just an absurd notion.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah.
Trying to be humble about it, the USHL over the last 8 seasons has more NHL drafted players than any other individual league in the world. That's a fact. That's verifiable. You can look up those numbers. And recently, Brad L.H. Schlossman, who's a phenomenal reporter, covers college hockey based out of Grand Forks, he kind of took a deeper dive on that and said, well, even if you remove NTDP on a per team basis, the USHL is still, this past year's draft had 1.6 players per team drafted out of. That's an awesome number. All of the other leagues are below that. So again, trying to be humble about it. All of those other leagues that contribute to the NHL are all good leagues. There's no question about it. We just have some uniqueness to the USHL that just, gives us an edge and an advantage.
Yeah, well, I think these players have gotten smart in realizing that by taking this USHL to college path, or maybe not to college, but it gives them more flexibility and control over when they sign, how they fit into the NHL CBA, how long they have until they're a free agent, all of those things. And, with especially with Cutter Gauthier, with Rutger McGroarty, those things have been on the forefront with decisions that those guys have made because they went those routes. So I think all those numbers were important. I think that introduction for our listeners was important. But now I want to get into the stuff that is more intriguing and more of the reason I really did want to have you on. And it's this whole CHL NCAA ruling that is on the horizon in November. And I just want to start by saying this to you. I've personally have flipped back and forth thinking this could be good. Maybe it's not good. It doesn't matter if I think it's good. It's happening. The NCAA hasn't. They don't even want to fight lawsuits anymore. They're laying down their armor every which way. And the best example that I've seen with this whole CHL or European players becoming eligible is in golf. When you have an amateur golfer who can qualify to play in the U.S. Open, if he wins, he can't take the prize money unless he wants to forfeit, but he can play and he can have expenses paid for in order to play. As college hockey players, Glenn, we have to, I had to pay for my own way to go to the Colorado Avalanche development camp after I was drafted. I had to pay a fee to go, right? They paid for my flight, but I had to pay a fee. Okay. I think that's how it was. Why can golfers do it and why can't hockey players do it? And what do you make of this whole NCAA CHL situation?
Well, I think the NCAA recognizes that they do have a lot of inconsistencies in their rules. I think that's what they call terming it for modernization. So I think they're having some of their own challenges, is why they lose lawsuits. You can't have differentials in the rules, and at least that seems to be how a lot of their court cases have gone. Now, under NCAA rules, it's under 12.2.2. it deals with the term actual and necessary expenses, which includes meals and lodging and equipment and coaching and health insurance. There's a bunch of things that fall into that. Beyond that, receiving compensation, that aspect doesn't seem to be changing. They didn't address what they call vicarious professionalism. So those things are yet to be addressed. And I give kudos to the Division I Council, because there was the notion that they were just going to vote this through this week, and they didn't. They paused it, and I think they want to get more information and gather information from places like USA Hockey, the USHL, possibly the NHL, so that they have a better understanding of how the ecosystem of hockey works. I think you would all agree that hockey for the development of college athletes is far different than any other sport. Every other sport, their athletes through high school sports. That does not happen in hockey. In Division I, 95% of all Division I players will have played junior hockey prior to entering college. So there are uniquenesses to our sport. And so, just to put a bow on the issue, for the USHL, rules change, landscapes change. We were hit with COVID. Our league still operated. We found ways to play games safely and to make sure we had a vibrant experience for our players, so that it didn't hit them in their important development year stages. You're starting to see some of those effects now happen with those players that were 13, 14 during COVID and where they're at now. So there's definitely challenges. I think for the NCAA, I think they're still grappling with the notion of, look at their principles. Their number one item listed in their principles is amateurism. We're guided by the Amateur Sports Act for all NGB sports. All Olympic sports in the United States are governed by the Amateur Sports Act. So I think they're still trying to grapple with how to reconcile this and still keep, all of their sports vibrant. I'm not sure how they arrive there. Mm-hmm. Will change. Our owners, our GMs, our coaches will adapt to whatever the rules are. We're not part of a collective bargaining agreement. We didn't get here, without having committed all of the hard work, all the financial resources. Our ownership, in order to meet these tier 1 standards, which are, identical to major junior in terms of the things you provide your players, it's a $6 million investment every year by our owners to meet those standards. So I'm very confident that whatever the rules are, we're going to be able to navigate through. And I certainly won't speak for the programs we feed. It's certainly in the interest of the National Hockey League and USA Hockey that the USHL remain a vibrant league. And I'm very confident that that will continue.
Well, that's one thing I wanted to talk to you about as well. And I also want to just say, for the people in our chat, feel free to ask questions. We'll read them, because I'm sure a lot of people, including myself, have a ton of questions with everything going on in this. But Glenn, I don't mean to necessarily challenge you here by this question. Okay, if I can. But I spoke to a assistant coach in NCAA yesterday who was a former head coach in the USHL. I'm not going to name him just in case he doesn't want to be named. Okay. But the point that he made was, right now, it feels like USA Hockey is finally winning this battle against Hockey Canada, right? We're getting the top players from Canada to come into the USHL and then go into college. If you allow the CHL players to go to college, instead of having to come to the USHL, how do we convince them to continue to come here if they can go to college anyway? And the guys that I'm talking about, are like the Fantillis, the Celebrinis, who could have the option to stay closer to home and play in Canada and even potentially get paid, a couple $100 a week by those leagues. What would now stop them from doing that, when it feels like the only benefit here when it comes to the CHL versus the USHL is for the CHL? I mean, that just seems to be the case. I mean, I would love to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, I'm going to push back, because
yeah, please do.
If you look at college hockey right now, it's 62% American, and the overwhelming majority of the remaining players are Canadian. So to suggest that Canadian players aren't finding their way to college hockey through other pathways, there are other leagues that contribute to college hockey. So there's pathways, and I think this whole argument is kind of overblown about, there's this terrible disadvantage. I think the CHL mindset and culture has been heavily directed at becoming professional hockey players. And the USHL's approach is just a bigger tent approach. We try to develop for pro and for college, and we've got the mechanisms in place take a look at the numbers from college hockey, or for just college sports in general, in terms of academic performance. Hockey, Men's hockey is always
always
great. Graduation rate 93%. In fact, the return rate, players that leave to go play pro and then come back to finish their degree, also impacts that score. So, I think we're going to continue to attract those players. I have very, very competitive owners and general managers that they live and die on every recruit. So they're going to be aggressive. We've got a very proven track record. I don't think there's anything that can dispute that. So I think that will continue. I think we'll continue to attract players. There's also a desire of players to want to have the American hockey experience. I mean, there's a reason why we're slightly lower in American numbers than the CHL is in Canadian numbers. They're much 92%. So I think we attract the best players from around the world. I believe right now we're sitting, I think, roughly about 80% American. I think there's about 60 players that are Canadian and 45 that are European in the league right now. And that's an awesome thing. It's a good experience for all of those athletes. And so I think we've been a really trusted method of advancement to college hockey. And I don't think that's going to change. So I hope, at least with the numbers, I hope that kind of gives you a sense of how, just looking at how college hockey is structured. I think we're going to continue to serve in the same way.
We have a question in the chat from Fourth Line asking, would the USHL ever merge with the CHL? That's something that I'd be interested in too. Like, the Memorial Cup is one of the cooler things in Canada. If the USHL can have a team like represented in that too, that'd be pretty awesome for North America.
I've been really fortunate over this last year. I'm starting my second year as commissioner. All of the CHL commissioners have changed. Dan McKenzie's been there, I think, for 5 years. He heads up the CHL. Dan Neer in the WHL. I've not had the pleasure of meeting with Mr. Crawford, but have with Mario Cecchini from the Q. And there's been several occasions, I also think maybe intentionally structured by the National Hockey League, to put us all in the same room together. It's been great. It's been both formal and informal, and the discussions have been phenomenal. And we've had these conversations. I had a nice invite from Dan McKenzie to attend the Memorial Cup this year. Had a great experience. They treated me really well, and I watched the level of play. I have no doubt that the USHL will fit perfectly in that, and so I certainly welcome the conversation. And we've had some dialogue about how do we work together, what does that look like, and I think if you look at it objectively, I think all of us, being in the room together, how do we find ways to work together? Because what we do at our level, we've perfected. So is the CHL. We're all really good at it. The bigger challenge for us, and I think the same for Canada, is what's happening at the younger age levels. Right now, hockey is so costly. We're starting to see players that only can afford to play at the AAA level. And a lot of the more talented players are not getting that opportunity because it's so expensive. And as you all know, the development path, you'll see a 14-year-old who looks like a phenom, and by the time he's 17, he's kind of fitting in as an average player. So every player's development path is different. We have some really big challenges at the younger age levels, diversity being one of them. We want a more diverse sport. I think the NHL and USA Hockey have made that clear. We have our own plans on making and contributing to that pathway and making sure that we attract the very best athletes. So, what we do, we're fine at our level. It's what's happening down below, the cost factor and accessibility. If you think about how every single young athlete's childhood athlete, where they experience their first youth sports experience, it's in their hometown. Mm-hmm. There's a reason why, and I know I'll probably get vilified for this. There's 20% of the USHL is made up of players from Minnesota. There's a reason. I got a tweet or a text message from my friend and colleague, the head of Minnesota hockey, Steve Olheiser, to talk about the state of Minnesota had more players than any other state in the union that were in NHL lineups on opening night.
Yeah. And listen, it doesn't surprise me.
It's community-based hockey. That's why it's affordable. It's accessible across the country. And you're going to, you'll explode the game. I marvel at what they do. I love their model. And, there's always some pushback because we're taking some of their best guys. it's been working for both of us.
All right, so I'm gonna ask you a couple of questions here in the chat, Glenn, and then I do have a follow-up question that's more a technical thing on how hockey players transferring works. But another question from the fourth line in our chat: will the USHL be adding teams? Like, what are the expansion plans for this league? And I just want to preface it by saying one of the things, in my opinion, that makes your league so good is that it is small. I think when I played in the USHL, Glenn, in Lincoln, I don't think we had more than 12 or maybe we had 14 teams in the league. It was a very small league. Madison wasn't in the league. Dubuque wasn't in the league. Muskegon wasn't in the league.
Wow.
And every night you were playing against someone who was getting drafted in the top 2 or 3 rounds, and you were playing against a team that had guys going to North Dakota, Minnesota, BU, BC. I mean, the talent pool was insanely good in that league, especially when it was like at 12 teams.
Well, so when was that? Was that like 1975? Colby, is that about right?
Hey, you're older than me, pal, so take it easy.
Not by much. So and I do remember all the gray hair you gave me over the years, Colby. The USHL has been at 16 teams plus or minus one since I believe it was 2010.
Okay.
And so there have been, over the last year, there has been a major uptick in interest in the league. We are considering several markets. Ultimately, this is a decision that the owners make. And they understand that I am only going to bring them opportunities that I think make sense and are good for the league. We have had we currently have an NHL owner who owns an NHL team who's an owner in the league. We've been contacted at least by 2 other NHL owners that have expressed an interest in the league. We've had several Canadian groups reach out and have expressed interest in joining the USHL. And there's probably about 6 legitimate opportunities that will be on the table for us to review. And I think it's very possible. And we'll have a staggered approach to it, where we could be adding 2 to 4 teams over the next 2 to 3 seasons.
Got it. Okay.
So that is not a Glenn Hefferan decision. That is a decision that is made by our owners, and
right.
I think that's just important to note.
But I think they brought you in here because they trust in your opinion, your guidance, your advisement. I know. They came looking for you when you became, when you got this job. You did not go looking for it. And I know that to be true, not from what you've told me, but from, talking to people around hockey. So there is another question that I had written down here that's pretty interesting to me. And this was something somebody made me aware of from USA Hockey. And I said, geez, that's a pretty interesting thought, how this works. So let's talk about the transfers between USA Hockey, Hockey Canada, how all that works, because I know this, like when a player comes from Europe, there's a European transfer agreement. When we have youth hockey players with the Titans, we have to get a youth hockey, transfer signed by their hockey federation. We have a kid who plays on one of our teams from Israel. So we had the Israeli Ice Hockey Federation has to sign something. How will that work, Glenn, if we do have a situation where, maybe a player's playing in the CHL and this changes, right? They're 16-year-old. This rule changes and they're like, you know what? I want to go play in Chicago because I want to be seen by Michigan and Wisconsin. So they then want to leave the Sudbury Wolves, and I'm just completely making that up, right? And they want to come play for the Chicago Steel. How will that work as far as are there contracts that get in the way? Is there visa issues that get in the way? And how easy of a process is or could that be?
And could you even go back? Like, could you go back if you wanted to go back to Canada after coming?
So once you play a game in either federation, you are bound to that team until the team decides to release you, trade you. Okay. In the U.S. side of it, we don't operate under contracts, although I'm sure that will be a discussion point going forward, and how that will work. So the IAHF kind of guides the international transfer rules, particularly as it relates to European players. USA Hockey and Hockey Canada have a transfer agreement that supersedes that. And it just makes for a workable arrangement. It's an older document. It needs updating, or as the NCAA likes to say, it needs modernization. That was written by Jim Johansson, over 15 years ago. And I think obviously that this has been a discussion point with us in USA Hockey that, the agreement needs updating, and, we're on the same playing field, and it needs to work that way. So I think there's a lot of discussion that still is yet to be had on what that will look like. But in the present, players that are in state or in the CHL, you now need to be traded if at consent. So no one's moving in the middle of the season. It doesn't work that way. And I think that's an important issue for everyone, irrespective of what league you are. Roster stability. I mean, you hear this conversation in the NCAA. Roster stability is so critical, and now you see college hockey mirroring what we do in youth hockey with players jumping around, and so I think roster integrity and stability is going to be an important issue for everybody, and I think there'll be conversations about that in the very, very near future.
I will say, I know people have their opinion about the transfer portal, but as someone who had to redshirt and sit out for a full year, I'm very happy that they got rid of that, because that was like the most depressing and miserable year of my life. Like, I'm not even trying to get deep or whatever. Just saying, like, the fact that a first line guy can jump schools and a guy who's unhappy in a situation can jump schools and get a better opportunity for himself. Like, I think that has changed so much for the better when it comes to this product. My last question, and again, I appreciate your time this morning, Glenn. This is a question actually that I had myself, but also somewhat asked by Steve Gross in the chat, and it's in regards to and the term amateurism now, because it feels like we're headed in a direction where calling these players, whether it's even down to the USHL and the CHL, amateurs now, is kind of going out the window with NIL and players being able to take money and whatnot. Is that a direction that we're headed in, where they'll no longer be called amateurs, or where do you see that playing out?
I think there's a little bit of confusion about NIL versus being compensated.
Pay to play.
Okay. Let's clear that up. Yeah.
I mean, how it would be any different that if you play for the Lincoln Stars and the local car dealership decides to hire you as their spokesperson, right? You're working a job. It's a job. Now for NIL, you guys talked about this in yesterday's show, proves that I do, guys.
Snaps.
A little bit more than you. That Colby is. No, I'm teasing Colby. Well, he grinds your gears, so I figured.
Always. You're welcome to it.
Thank you. I think there are restrictions with respect to international athletes taking advantage of NIL. I know there's legislation sitting in the federal government that would kind of open that up, but then you have counter legislation that is talking about, restricting, non-U.S. citizens in the scholarship lane. So it's going to be interesting to watch how this House settlement agreement levels that playing field. They're talking about $22 million in payroll. Well, now if you're paid, you're going to be a paid athlete, right? So there's a lot of things that are going to come together. And for us as being part of a national governing body, there's definite advantages from an antitrust standpoint. And, the issue of paying players to play and perform, invokes a lot of other issues in terms of fair labor practices. We're not in that lane, and I'm grateful not to be in that lane. We have players that absolutely have NIL deals, and we welcome that, and we try to find ways, if it conflicts with current sponsors, we try to find ways to manage those things. And I'm thrilled when we see our players get NIL deals, and it's great for them, and we want to see them take advantage of that. We don't want that certainly to change. I think the lane we're in might actually be more appealing to, let's say, others that are not in the amateur lane. And I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and just to even, go further with Glenn's comment, he's talking about legislation in the U.S. Senate, and what I have learned about this whole NIL thing with these these non-U.S. players. So if you're from Canada, you're from Europe, you are on a student visa, so you cannot have a job here. Now you can earn passive income, which I explained on the show yesterday, But you cannot earn income unless it is passive, and you can Google the definition of that, and there's probably lots of interpretations for all that. So that's kind of where those guys get put into a bubble of it has to be passive income. That needs to change for these guys. But the U.S. government moves at a snail's pace. We can all agree on that, no matter how we feel about any of that. So look, Glenn, it was great having you on.
Section on amateurism and athletics eligibility. It's Article 12 of the NCAA bylaws. When you read it, I promise you this, you will be scratching your head afterwards going, well, wait a minute. And because a lot of it does seem to conflict, and so, which is probably why they've had these challenges in the litigation area. So,
and it doesn't even seem like the NCAA is interested in more litigation. They've completely laid down their armor. It's so funny, this whole thing that's happening, because this is actually something in my own family that has been, this goes back so many years because of my first cousin being Jeremy Bloom. And this is a guy who in like the early 2000s, he was a skier and a football player, and he sued the NCAA because they took away his amateur status based on his skiing endorsements, which he needed to fund his skiing career. So he was knocked out of the NCAA after 2 years, forced to enter the NFL draft way too early, is considering going after the NCAA right now, like other players are. Former players, but I would urge you to Google the, Jeremy Bloom NCAA. He's a football player. So this is, funny enough, something that has been so, vivid in my family for a number of years because of Jeremy's situation. So now watching it all unfold, him and I are always texting about it, and it's mostly just like sarcastic emojis that he's sending me back when these things are happening. I know he's enjoying watching the NCAA get their ass kicked.
I would say this, I think for the sake of all collegiate sports, but more particularly for hockey, hockey is the third highest grossing revenue sport on a per team basis. We certainly understand where football, and again, just there's 100,000 male Division I athletes, 1,800 of them are hockey players. 25% of them are playing football or basketball. At the end of the day, I think college sports needs to be careful to not create more haves and have-nots. And that is I think that is a prevailing concern that we heard in May during the coaches convention in Florida. Like, you just can't keep creating more, because eventually that pool will then start shrinking. What's going to be left? What are you going to have? 20 college teams left? One of the other topics that no one's covered or spent enough time on is the 35 university schools in Canada that have really good programs. Okay, but they're all mostly CHL players.
Yeah, they're good. They're good teams.
They're playing some of the Division I teams.
They do.
So, there's a lot more to this than just what's being covered, in the front page of the media on this stuff. So
yeah, I mean, look, every year, Glenn,
conversation about it.
Every year at BU, we started the year with either UAB or New Brunswick, like one of these schools. So look, Glenn, you know what? I say this to you all the time, and I hope your PR team is watching this, and the communications wing of the USHL. They need to get you out there speaking more often, because I just think that you shed so much interesting light on these topics, and we've had so many conversations, and I never don't hang up, and I'm like, interesting, or like, I wasn't thinking about that, or like, geez, like, more times than not, when I'm calling you, it's because I need my mind changed about something, because I know that I'm probably wrong. So great having you on today. I know you follow the show. You're always, giving me shit about it or reaching out, about the show. So, make sure
just for all the time you pick on Johnny. That's all.
Exactly. He does defend you all the time. And
I love that. I need that.
I'm not a Ranger fan, Johnny, either. So just
Glenn, my mom would love you. Thank you for saying that.
All right, Glenn, look, you have a good day, and we'll talk soon. Okay, Glenn?
Thanks, guys.
What's up, hockey fans? If you enjoyed that video, then you need to be hitting the subscribe button right here at Daily Faceoff. Exclusive interviews and analysis from our hockey insider Frank Saravalli, fantasy updates from Brock Sagan, and a daily live show at noon Eastern, Monday through Friday. You don't want to miss any of the fantastic content, so hit that subscribe button.